In the 16th century, it was no measure. It was the good and the bad, the black and the white. Since we opened this museum, a lot of people came from all around the world to hear and to see more about John Calvin.
The Reformation Museum in Geneva is an extraordinary place to visit. Here you'll see mementos and images and wonderful educational presentations to explain Calvin's theology, his ideas of predestination, the authority of the Word of God, the distinctives of the Calvinistic faith, put before you, and it's worth your visit. It's located right next door to the Saint-Pierre Cathedral, and the beautiful Saint-Pierre Cathedral was built as a testimony to the wonderful Christian faith that had come to this place that was pagan. But everything changed when the Reformation came.
The citizens gathered in the small piazza out here and had one of the earliest democratic elections in which they voted as citizens to become Protestant. And one night the sun went down. They were a Roman Catholic parish. The next morning when they voted, they declared themselves by the authority as citizens of Geneva to be a Protestant community, a city-state.
As you walk into Saint-Pierre Cathedral, you'll to this day find a plaque that tells how the citizens of Geneva came together, and they decided that they would bring the Reformation to this city.
This is the plaque Geneva put up on the cathedral right after they adopted the Reformation and asked the Catholics to leave. It says, "The tyranny of the Roman Antichrist having been slain, and its superstitions abolished in the year 1536, the very holy religion of Christ having been re-established in its truth and purity, and the church put back into good order by the favor of God, the enemies having been pushed back and made to flee, and the city herself by a great miracle having been given back its liberty, the Senate and people of Geneva have erected and put this monument in this place as a perpetual memorial to attest to all future generations their gratefulness toward God."
Basically what they said, no longer would they follow the Pope as the authority of their teachings, but they would test everything by the Word of God. And by looking at the Scriptures, they discovered that Roman Catholic teaching was not the truth of the Bible. And so the Reformation came to that city under the leadership of William Farel.
Geneva, after a whole process of thinking about this, adopted the Reformation, and in that adoption, they decreed public education obligatory for all children of Geneva. That's the first time that ever happened in the world.
One of the early actions then that we find in the Reformation that came to Geneva was the establishment of a school for clergy, a school for children, a school that would train people in the knowledge of the Reformation that was based upon the Scriptures. Now that work began to go forward with great success, but there were many problems that they had to work out. First of all, there were powerful families that had their own interests. There was a city council that wanted to make their influence known more than the Reformation influence of Farel. There also was the problem of the bigger powers that surrounded this little city-state. There was the city of Bern that had more power perhaps than Geneva, and so exercised influence. And then there was Savoy to the south, a kingdom that was part Italian, part French in influence, that had a desire to exercise Roman Catholic influence and wanted to take back Geneva from its Protestant views.
The Duke of Savoy was, of course, very Catholic, and he wanted Geneva back because when Geneva took over as Protestants, they stole the cathedral. Basically, it was a permanent borrowing of the cathedral, and they wanted it back. The Savoy soldiers climbed up ladders onto the walled city of Geneva to try and take Geneva. And the Genevans woke up because of a lady who had a pot of stew that she was cooking, and she threw it on the head of one of these soldiers, and it caused a big racket of noise. And so the whole city woke up and defeated the Savoys, and Geneva was saved.
So Geneva was a city that was caught between friendly Protestant powers and antagonistic Roman Catholic powers. The Reformation had come, and John Calvin came. And when Farel persuaded Calvin to stay by his imprecation, the curse that he placed upon his desire to be a traveling scholar, Calvin began to enter into this work of building a city for the kingdom of Christ from the Protestant perspective, according to the Word of God. That meant that many things had to change. There were rules that had to come into the city that would limit some of the sinfulness that had been part of the past. Issues that dealt with prostitution.
In 1566, there was a law that said that any buyer or seller of sex was to be publicly mitered. They had to wear these hats publicly. The smaller one was for women, the larger one for men. They were publicly ashamed. They were then whipped, and they were banned from Geneva forever. And so that was some pretty rigorous discipline. That was not necessarily just church discipline, that was city discipline.
That dealt with the abuse of alcohol, that required church attendance.
You would have been required by law to go to church, and if you didn't, you would have been punished, not by the church, but by the civil magistrate. There would be civil penalties for that.
When people were living a lawless life, when they were guilty of sexual misconduct, when they were neglecting worship, the elders of the church here in Geneva loved them enough to say, that's not the way that a Christian should live.
And so Calvin had to wrestle with, what is the relationship of the church with the state?
Calvin began, even in that time, to argue for the right of the church, distinct from that of the state, to administer and defend its own ordinances. And so he was against what we would call today Erastianism, in which the state interferes with matters of the church.
This was different than the church in Zwingli, Zurich. Zwingli was under a system where the magistrate said, we run the state and we run the church as well. That approach has been called Erastianism, after a thinker by the name of Erastus, who argued that the church should always be under the power of the state. Now we know the Roman Catholic tradition said the state, in its ideal form, should be under the church. That gets us into the medieval Roman Catholic model, where the Pope said, we are in charge of everything. And we can think of some of the points in medieval tradition where the Pope literally excommunicated the emperor. There's another view, and that's the radical separation of church and state. That's what we've often seen in recent years in America, that argues that we need a naked public square, that the church has no room to play in the life of civics or civilian life. It must be in a holy huddle, separated from the life of people in government. But Calvin's model said, no, the church and state must be different, but they must cooperate. I would call that a friendly separation between church and state.
For John Calvin, there simply was not going to be this sort of hard-line separation of church and state that we have. He believed that the church had a responsibility to speak into the realm of the state. He wasn't interested in a theocracy. He was interested in hearts being transformed. He was interested in truth, and the truth of God. John chapter 8, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. He wanted the people free.
And that model ultimately prevailed. A very effective church system that worked regularly side by side with the state, but each having their own spheres, and each saying to the other, we need to hear from you, but you have no authority here. This is our realm of oversight. And there's a particularly interesting scene where Calvin was celebrating the Lord's Supper, and one of the magistrates of the city wanted to come, whose life was not acceptable in terms of his moral conduct. And Calvin said, you may not come to the table. And according to tradition, it says he opened his breast and he said, let the dagger go here first before you come to the Lord's Supper. I will not let it be defiled. What he was saying is the church must be distinct from the state to exercise its proper work. The idea of the distinction between church and state and the freedom of the church, as well as the freedom of the government, was a foundational principle of Calvin.
John Calvin was a religious thinker, but he was also a statesman and a man who had a strong influence on governmental policy at all levels. The Republic of Geneva, which flourishes today, is based on the theological principles established by John Calvin at the time of the Reformation. And those ideas were exported first to Holland and other European countries, also to England and Scotland, and then to the United States. And those ideas were that man is fallen, man is a sinner. If men have too much power over other men, they will tend to abuse it. So therefore there should be separation of powers, there should be limited government, and governmental power should be close to the people. So if the people want to make a change, it is easy for the people to throw the rascals out. And that is a principle that I believe has worked in the United States. It was the theory of the Pilgrims and the Puritans who came here as Calvinists from the Old World to the New. And it has served the people of Switzerland very well, as they have adopted these principles in their own national and state governments.
So the Calvinistic model of church and state, I think, ultimately came to America.
When Presbyterianism came to the United States, there was a feeling, there was a concern, it was a biblical concern as well as an experiential, historical concern, that this blending of church and state was not healthy for the gospel in the church and for the discipline and the integrity of the church, nor was it helpful for the church's interrelation with the state. And so from the very beginning of Presbyterianism, when the confession was adopted, there was a rejection of what would have been called the establishment principle, and a kind of what I would say a moderate voluntarism, not a voluntarism that says that the church never has anything to say to the state, not a voluntarism that reduces Christianity to some sort of a private pietistic thing that doesn't have any public face, but a relinquishing of the church's interference in a direct way with the matters of the state, so that the church can speak prophetically to the state without being entangled with the state. And so there's a strong tradition of what we call separation of church and state. Now that term itself can be misused in very, very unhelpful ways, but the idea of those two authorities functioning in unique spheres that do not intersect is an idea that you begin to see growing in Geneva, more in Scotland, but finally come to fruition under Witherspoon and others for very obvious reasons in the United States.
The legacy of a Republican government comes very much out of the Presbyterian form of church government. It's not surprising that many of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence and the men who framed the Constitution of the United States were Presbyterians. And you really see the thumbprint of John Calvin on representative democracy in the Western world and in other places in the world today.
It was enshrined in a much better form than it had ever been worked out in our First Amendment, where it tells us that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion, and it shall not abridge the free exercise thereof of the rights, ultimately, of our religious conscience. These words that stem from Calvinistic Geneva show us what the culture was to be like in Calvin's mind. It was to be a place where church and state were working together but were distinct, creating a culture where there was moral rule, effectual application of government, and yet a good deal of freedom. There are rights and wrongs found in the Ten Commandments. There are rules that must especially be enforced by the church, the rules of membership in the church, how communion is to be administered, what doctrine is to be taught. There are things that the state alone has a right to establish. How does a person become a citizen? Whether we should fight a war? What is the right amount of taxation? And as these two ideas of church and state cooperated but were always different, it created a community where business could flourish. And isn't it amazing, as you look at the city of Geneva, that it became one of the most successful business places ever in the history of Western civilization. In Calvin's Geneva, business flourished. And there's a reason for that, because there was security. The businessman knew there was a right and wrong that would be enforced in the church, a right and wrong that would be enforced in the state. And while the church and state were different, together they established a way of doing things that would predict the future in the public square. That made it a wonderful place to establish a business because you knew how to invest your money. And as freedoms began to unfold, another wonderful concept of Calvin began to take root. An old medieval tradition was usury was all interest gained on money, that banking was inherently evil, that it was a way of stealing money from your neighbor. Calvin carefully analyzed the scriptures, and he looked at the logic of things, and he said there's a difference between usury and interest. He said that if a businessman who has food and clothing and shelter has extra money, but not enough to do a project that he thinks is good, it's totally right for him to borrow money from his neighbor, and his neighbor to say, I will help you accomplish your task, provided that if it succeeds, I get some money. And it becomes a covenant, a contract, where both are blessed. Jesus himself said to the man who hid his talent in the ground, couldn't you at least have put this money on loan with the bankers and have made some interest? That idea is at the core of the cultural success of Geneva. But Geneva is more than that. Geneva was also a place that wanted to not only have business success, to have religious liberty, have powerful but distinct functions of the government cooperating with church and the free market, but they also wanted to avoid war if they possibly could. Geneva realized it was a small city-state. It did not have a lot of military power. And so it created a spirit of independence and cooperation. And the idea of neutrality in war, if at all possible, became a hallmark of historic Reformed theology. Instead of trying to fight every battle, trying to be a good neighbor to everyone to the best of your ability. What we also see going on in Geneva is that as the Reformation began to take root in other countries like Italy, that there were people from Italy that needed refuge. The reasons they were fleeing? Because of the Inquisition that was going to cause their families to be burned at the stake or lose all their property. And so hundreds and over the years thousands of people flocked from different parts of persecuted Europe to move into Geneva.
This city was open to anyone who would come and accept the teachings and the principles that were being put into practice here. And that has affected the city. You know, the United Nations, a lot of their humanitarian work is based here today. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees is based here, doing, as I see it, just tremendous work among these desperately oppressed people around the world, trying to bring them basic care and support. The Red Cross was founded here. Again, I think a direct correlation of the sort of thing Calvin and others were teaching, these principles of human equality and of God's care for the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan.
Well, to this day, you can walk through the streets of Geneva and see that it's a city of refuge, a city where people have come to find asylum. It's no surprise that international peace organizations have met here.
If you look at what John Calvin contributed to the life of this city, his commitment to education, not just for boys but for girls, founding the Geneva Academy, which has become this great university, his commitment to showing hospitality to refugees that were coming from all over the world. That's really the start of the work of UNICEF and organizations that are recognized as doing good work around the world today. Or even the hospital that was founded here in Geneva. I mean, all of this is part of Calvin's legacy, caring for the body as well as for the soul.
So we look at the ancient city of Geneva and we realize that in the hands of Calvin, it became a place of theological and ethical leadership. It has continued to be a place of ethical leadership to this day. Although when you walk into that great cathedral, It doesn't have the crowds that flocked in to hear the preaching of Calvin because of the power of hearing the Word of God in their own language. It was novel, it was powerful, and it was bringing down the Pope of Rome.